How we doing, gentlemen? Here is our lecture for today. As you can see, we got some great background music to start. Just doing what I usually do, listen to some Mozart to get me in the mood for some global studies. Today's objective and key question: how did the following areas evolve during the Middle Ages? So we're going to be looking at England, France, as well as the papacy. And remember, the papacy is referring to the Pope. Before we get into the evolution of European kingdoms, let's take a look at a review from some previous lessons. Okay, 2 lessons ago, you started learning about feudalism in Europe. And remember, when we look at feudalism, at the top we have the king. Below the king are the lords, the vassals, the knights, and then we have the peasants. A few things some of you seem to have some questions on or be a little bit confused about. Remember, feudalism is an example of a decentralized government, and this occurs, one of the causes is really the fall of the Roman Empire. And remember, between the king and the lords and the vassals, there is this exchange that occurs. So the lords are going to give the vassals land, and in return, the vassals will have to give the lords service and their loyalty. And remember, these vassals can also have their own vassals. And remember what we call that: sub-infeudation. Don't forget also the importance of the church. Even though the king is at the top of this feudal state in Europe, it is really the church and the Pope who has the most influence in Christian Europe. And then also you started taking a look at what's going on these manors, right? On the manor, this would kind of be like, for us, if we look at like American history, kind of like almost a plantation. The manor would be self-sufficient. Everything that you would ever need would be produced and you would have on the manor. And some of you guys were asking questions about these peasants and serfs. So a serf is basically someone who has really no rights. He is a poor farmer who is going to be working the land on the manor for the Lord. Serfs did not really have any rights. If they wanted to marry, they'd have to ask permission from the Lord. And they also couldn't leave the manor without the permission of the Lord. So these are some things that we're going over in feudalism over the past few classes. Well, we're going to continue to take a look at what is going on in Europe and how some of these kingdoms, England, France, as well as what's going on with the papacy during the Middle Ages. So let's start with England. So England in the High Middle Ages. I put a bunch of years here for you on your notes. You don't have to memorize these years, so just to give you an idea of what time period we're talking about. So in the late 800s, we have Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great is considered the first king of England, and he did defeat the Vikings. But as we get into the High Middle Ages, the death of Edward the Confessor is a significant event because before he died, he is going to acknowledge that the throne, the next king of England, is going to be this man, William of Normandy. And Normandy is in northern France. So it's interesting that we have the king of England giving the throne to a Frenchman. And you could understand why many English are not going to like the idea of having a Frenchman as their king. So many of the English, they're going to actually veto Edward's wishes. And they're going to say, no, it's not going to be William of Normandy. We are going to select Harold Godwinson as the next king. And that's what ends up happening is the king is going to be King Harold, because the English are the ones who are going to veto the dead king's wishes. As you can imagine, William is not going to take this lightly. He wants to be king, so he decides that he's going to invade England. He's going to invade England, and he's going to try to defeat Harold in open battle so that he could claim the throne. And this is one of the most significant events in the beginning of the evolution of England in the Middle Ages. And the battle that's going to take place is a very famous battle in world history called the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And William is going to land on the coast of England. He's going to invade with his troops. So if we take a look at this map, we can see where Normandy is. So William is going to cross the English Channel with his troops, and he's going to meet Harold's troops at the Battle of Hastings in southern England. And at this battle, William is going to defeat Harold Godwinson, King Harold, and now William is going to be crowned the King of England. You're going to be learning a lot more about some of the details of this battle. Your your homework for tonight is going to take you to this video on the Battle of Hastings, and you're going to actually see the video is really well done. It actually goes onto the battlefield in present-day England, the battlefield of the Battle of Hastings, and this historian is going to walk you through the battlefield and show you what happened that day. You're going to see some descriptions of the battle, the weapons that were used during the battle, the disadvantage of Harold's army during the battle, as well as how a rumor affected the battle. There's also a very famous tapestry, the Bayeux Tapestry, that you'll take a look at from the video and just see what it was like, the weapons that were used, and how William was able to conquer King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. So you'll be doing that for homework. You'll see a lot more details about the Battle of Hastings there. William the Conqueror is what he's known as, King William or William the Conqueror. He's going to give Norman knights land in England, and he's going to establish a centralized monarchy. So we can see how this is going to be a little bit different from what we're talking about with feudalism, which is decentralized. William the Conqueror is going to start to centralize power in England. And the effects of this conquest are really important. William now is going to be in a very, very unique circumstance. He is going to be both the King of England, but at the same time, he's going to be the Duke of Normandy. So think about this. He is the leader of a country, the ruler and monarch of England, but he's the Duke of Normandy. So if he's the Duke, that means technically he is a vassal to the French king. So we have the King of England in control of his territory up here, but we also know that in Normandy, he needs to obey any wishes and still serve his lord, which is technically the French king. So a very, very unique circumstance. And as time goes on, William will eventually die, and the government of England will continue to develop. King Henry II, who was king in the mid-1100s to the late 1100s, he's going to strengthen the power of the royal courts, and he's going to institute something very important called common law. This is something that we kind of take for granted, but this is law that is common to the whole kingdom and replaces the different law codes that varied from place to place. So remember, during feudalism, you'd have different lords, different towns that would have their own law codes. Common law is trying to have one law for the country, for all of England, rather than different law codes for different towns. So clearly we can see the centralization of government beginning and developing in England, not only as a result of William the Conqueror, but also of King Henry II. King John, who was after King Henry II in the early 1200s, he is going to sign something that has great significance in English history, and also for just the development of representative government. So the Magna Carta is going to be signed in 1215 in Runnymede, England. And he's basically going to be forced to sign this. The nobles are going to kind of go right outside his quarters and threaten him into signing the Great Charter or the Magna Carta. And what this is going to do is it's going to limit some powers of the king and grant some liberties to the nobles. So this is the first time in English history where the monarch's king, his power is going to be limited as a result of the Magna Carta being signed. And remember, up to this point, whenever we talk about governments in history, the monarch always has absolute power. And for the first time, we're seeing some of that power being limited. And as we move forward to King Edward II, he's going to do something and take it a step further. He's going to establish and develop the first ever parliament in England. And the parliament is basically just a council. We could also call it like a congress. Originally, it was meant for meetings of the King's Great Council, but Edward is going to change that. He's going to invite 2 knights and 2 residents from each town to join him in his council, because he wants to get consent for these new taxes that he's going to be passing. So it's interesting that we have, usually the king would just say what the taxes are. He would have absolute power. But we have King Edward now asking for the consent of the people. So even though he still has ultimate power, he is granting some access to the government and some power to the government, to the people, to this first parliament in the late 1200s. And the parliament in England has 2 houses, the House of Commons and the... So as we move out of England into France and the French kingdom, this man Hugh Capet is going to be the last Carolingian king. Remember the Carolingian dynasty? This was started by Charles Martel, and that dynasty is going to come to an end in the late 900s. And as a result, after this dynasty comes to an end, a new dynasty known as the Capetian dynasty will begin. And the Capetian kings, they had little real power, and many of the dukes, right, these are really lords, in many instances had really even more power than the Capetian kings. Philip IV for France is going to do something similar to what we saw King Edward do. He's going to start a French parliament and bring it into being. And there are 3 estates. This is really important. There are 3 estates, social classes in France. The first estate, which are the clergy, the second estate, which are the nobles, and the third estate, who are the townspeople. And he is going to start the first French parliament out of these estates in 1302. So again, for the first time, we're having, just like in England, some power and some consent being given to the people. As we look at our map of Europe, you can see how France is still not unified as it is today. We have these different territories like Aquitaine and Anjou and Normandy and Brittany. These are all territories inside. So you would have the Duke of Aquitaine, the Duke of Normandy. All of these are territories inside of France. And we can also see where England is as well. Remember the Battle of Hastings, where William the Conqueror crosses the English Channel and invades England and defeats King Harold. Our last development that we're going to take a look at today is the development of the papacy or the Pope. So remember, Christianity is an integral part of European society. When the Pope said something, when he made a directive or when he made a statement, that affected the actions of all kings throughout Europe. And Christian teachings are going to touch the lives of all Europeans because of how serious the faith was taken throughout the Middle Ages. When we look at the territory that the Pope is controlling, it is the Papal States. Remember the donation of Pepin. Pepin was the son of Charles Martel. So not only the Vatican, but also this region, this yellow region here, is being controlled by the Pope. And one of the more confusing terms for this unit is called lay investiture. And it has to do with the Pope and one of the kings in Europe, a German king. So first, let's define what lay investiture is. The term lay is referring to a lay person, right? So a lay person is someone who is a non-religious, so not a priest, not a clergyman. And lay investiture is when you would have a lay person who would be the king or a lord, right? This would be a lay person, not a priest, not a bishop. The king or the lords were actually investing, or they were actually choosing and appointing bishops. So we know, right, like the way it's supposed to be under the church is that bishops are supposed to be appointed by the Pope. But throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, lay investiture was occurring, where the king or lord, the lay person who was powerful in Europe, was actually the one appointing the bishop. So it was kind of secularizing the office of the bishop. Where the church should have been appointing it, it was actually the king or the lord who was appointing the bishop. So you can see the problem with that from the church's perspective. And finally, one of the popes, Pope Gregory VII, he decides that he's going to fight this practice. And he's going to say that through the Pope's authority, that he's going to forbid high-ranking clerics from receiving their investiture from lay leaders. So basically, Pope Gregory VII, he's going to say that a lay investiture must stop. It must end. There's no more appointing of bishops by the king or the lord. But the king of Germany has an issue with this. King Henry IV. He says, you know what? I'm not going to listen to the Pope. He's going to disobey. He's not going to obey Pope Gregory VII's basically directive in forbidding lay investitures, and say, I'm going to do it anyway. I don't care. So there's a struggle that occurs between the king and the Pope, which is known as the investiture controversy. And it's actually going to go on for years. There isn't going to be a compromise until 1122, and that compromise is called the Concordat of Worms. And basically, under this agreement, it's going to be really a combination, the Concordat of Worms. It's going to be a combination of lay investiture with the Pope's approval, which really just combine lay investiture and the way that it should be, where you have the Pope appointing those bishops. So that's lay investiture. And then finally, our last topic is education in the High Middle Ages. The university system as we know it is really begun during the Middle Ages. Faculty, students, and degrees were a product of the High Middle Ages. And the liberal arts curriculum was something that was also part of the High Middle Ages curriculum. And this is a combination of various subjects: grammar, logic, math, music, astronomy. Really, if you have a liberal arts community, it's really just about being well-rounded and having knowledge of all these various subjects. And something else that was kind of interesting, that what came about during this time, because we have the role of the church being so important, but you have some people who are becoming more and more educated in science, you're going to have something called scholasticism occur. And scholasticism is really a combination of philosophical elements and theological elements. You may have heard of it more simply as like using faith and reason. And most famously, St. Thomas Aquinas writes the Summa Theologica, which basically is going to give reason to use science or to use our mind with our faith to come up with basically evidence for God. So what you're going to be doing for classwork and homework, your homework, like we said before, is on the Battle of Hastings and watching the video and answering the questions. And your classwork is going to be taking a look at some details from the Battle of Hastings from your textbook, and then also the university system, and finally just a little excerpt, a summary from the Summa Theologica and the evidence for God that St. Thomas Aquinas points out in his famous work, Summa Theologica. So that is all for today's lesson. I will play you guys out with a further rendition of Mozart. Have a good day, guys.